So we're going to start. I'm Molly Kelley. This is Andy Lewis, and we prepared this webinar. It's a walkthrough in evaluating teaching materials for inclusivity. The structure is going to be, first we're going to talk about some kind of facts about queer students. We're going to move into some guidelines that we suggest that you use when you're evaluating sources. And then we'll go through some more specific and concrete examples. If you have questions, there's a chat screen that you can type your question into, and feel free to ask questions as we go. And we'll try to answer them. And it'll also be interactive as we get to the textbook examples and some of that stuff that we've pulled out. So let's just start here. So there's a few facts about our student populations that we want you to know. One is that nearly 20% of people are non-heterosexual. And a further group of people, you also have transgender students, you also have intersex students. And in all these cases, students are assumed straight until proven gay.
This assumption kind of negatively affects a lot of the language learning experiences of our students. For example, we have queer ESL students have reported anxiety in heteronormative classrooms. They have expressed a desire to learn in these more inclusive classrooms where our materials show more perspectives. And interestingly, to me at least, I thought when I heard it, was a lot of them are motivated by issues of identity. So they come here and learn English in order to exist in a place that might be more supportive of them. And we know that anxiety and attitude towards learning and the learning environment have substantial effects on learning language, on language learning motivation. And some of these things would negatively affect their experiences in our classroom. However, I think some of these facts are becoming more and more well-known, so people tend to like to use more inclusive materials. However, not all inclusion is created alike. We're not, I don't know, I'm going to start this, we're going to say it a number of times, I think. We're not looking for like a perfect source, but thinking about more of some of these sources as you go. So for instance, some sources can often stereotype characters by having them act as just like someone there so that I can talk about their identity, as opposed to making that character a more active, purposeful role in a narrative or whatever kind of thing you're doing. So they don't have any agency, they don't do anything for the plot, they're just there to be like, hey, there's a gay. And that's a problem, I think. So there's that.
So we have a proposal, which is making our classrooms safe and inclusive. And that means we're gonna have to be more discerning in our methods of selecting materials. We're gonna provide some guidelines to use when considering these materials. We hope that they'll be helpful for you. And before you go through the guidelines, I want to point out a couple things. One is that no source is perfect, but we have to actively consider the choices that our teaching materials have on our students. We have to be sensitive to a variety of identities so that our students feel heard, so that they're motivated, so that they're engaged. And we want to also stress that these guidelines do not make your class a gender studies class. These guidelines are more about including materials that acknowledge queer existence rather than discussing queerness or, being critical of gender theory or something like this.
Yeah, I think we're already working on the assumption that we trust that you're assuming I have to meet curricular goals, right? That's right. Obviously one of the guidelines, but we're already kind of working off that assumption as well. So some of these guidelines for inclusivity for us include, the one that we're just like, don't do this, is including materials that debate queer people's existence, humanity, or worthiness of rights. This to us is important because it's basically saying this is not a controversy, right? These people exist. That's not something that we should say, should they or shouldn't they, how or how shouldn't they. It's just, these people exist, they're humans, they're worthy of rights because they exist. So starting those conversations is often not a great experience for anyone in the classroom, I don't think.
Yeah, and this is also important because not even just that they exist, it's that we're them, they're in the classroom, and it really makes a destructive learning environment if you open up you know, someone's existence as being open to controversy within the classroom they're learning in, that's just a huge problem.
The next one is to consciously take stock of the resources that you've decided to use. I think the biggest way to ask this question is, are all or most of your sources written by or from the perspective of someone in a position of social power? So if it's not to say that you can't use things by like a straight, white, rich Christian man, sure, go for it. But make sure that that's not the only source and the only perspective that you're using. That does allow all of your students to kind of understand that they're here, they're getting something, and all of their perspectives are respected.
Good. So we do have a question before you go forward.
Mm-hmm.
So our question is, does that include, the first one, do not include materials that debate queer people's existence? The question is, does that include debates about gay marriage? And I would say yes, especially in the United States where gay marriage is legal. We don't need to have a debate about whether or not people think that is okay or not okay. Unless there's empirical academic evidence that shows that queerness is wrong, it doesn't belong in an academic classroom. So in my opinion, no, we should not be having debates about whether or not gay marriage should or should not be okay. It just is okay. It just is a law. It just is what's happening.
I would say that that kind of falls underneath the idea too of queer people's existence. Like, these relationships exist. You can't say they don't, right? Again, these
Right.
relationships are human, and these relationships are worthy of rights. That debate is kind of had, right?
Right,
so.
and the debate about, you know, how you feel about queer people, you know, is different than do they exist. Like, you can dislike that gay marriage exists, but it does. So, you know, it's not really appropriate in a classroom to have a big discussion about what biases come up when people consider gay marriage laws. It is a law. Gay marriage does exist, you know. So I really don't think that that's a topic that we need to include, at least anymore. So.
Yeah, it also doesn't get at the goal of what we're doing this for, right? We're creating an inclusive environment so that people can feel comfortable learning, no matter who they are, and that conversation puts people on opposite ends of an issue,
Right.
or having to pretend like they aren't if they don't want to out themselves in discussing.
So maybe we'll move on to the next one, but feel free to keep asking questions.
Great.
Maybe we will.
Okay. So this kind of applies more for the longer narratives, but for considering the role of queer characters or people in the materials you're using, sometimes, again, that role can be less agentive, less important, and just their identity is being used. And we'll see some examples of what that is too. And finally, when there are materials that you kind of have to use, or materials that are not like horrible materials, right? But there is a lack of queer perspectives, you can supplement materials when needed. And so part of this is judging when to supplement materials and when to kind of not. Yeah, that's about it for this.
Okay, so we hope you can see on your screen, we hope your screen's big enough. So based on some of these guidelines, I want you to think about whether you would or would not use this Pathways book. Are the photo screens covering it up? Can anyone tell me? Can you see the whole paper? I hope so.
Yeah.
So based on what we've discussed, would you use this in class? This is from Pathways 3, 2012. And it's a chapter that it's in a chapter that they're kind of trying to teach about gender and sexuality, so. So let's just point out a couple things that we've noticed and chime in if you have anything else to say. So the first one is there's just a lot of assumptions being made here. So for example, that names that end in Y are girls' names, where fill in the blank 2 has a girl's name that doesn't end in Y, for example. Like, it goes beyond stereotyping. It's just a very strange choice. We also have things like, in the United States, women wear light colors like pink because it makes them appear more feminine. Is that even true? Or if they wear pink, is it because they want to wear feminine or want to look feminine, or maybe they just like pink? There are a lot of very strange assumptions being made here. And then this book also confuses gender and sex several times throughout the chapter. So this is a good example. We were just talking about our class shouldn't be a class on gender studies. We're not, quite frankly, we're not qualified to teach a class on gender studies. So I'm not totally sure why Pathways went this route in this book. But, you know, this has the potential to not only confuse students, but even in answering these questions, the writer makes a lot of assumptions of us about what we think and what our viewpoints are.
This is a little bit odd too, because the discussion of gender and sex in society now is a little bit more advanced than some of these things. So
Right.
When we do teach students these kinds of words and these assumptions throughout this, it can affect just the way that they exist in class, but it can also kind of affect the way that they exist out in the world outside of it, right? So they learn these words and then use them, and then people might judge them based off of the fact that they're misunderstanding gender or sex, or they're assuming certain things about men or women that we might not anymore.
Right. I mean, even number 4. So they want even only female animals can have babies. If you have a trans man, that person can have a baby. You get into all this like territory we really don't need to go into. And then at the same time, just making a lot of kind of strange assumptions. So this chapter is, let me go back here. We have some questions. So we have some people saying they wouldn't use it. Good. Pink is feminine. Yeah, and this comment here, it says, it seems like they were going for an explanation more of traditional gender roles in US culture. That's exactly it. It's acting on these assumptions that may or may not even apply. So yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. So here's a couple picture dictionaries. One is Oxford Picture Dictionary. This is an older one, so I don't actually have the newer one. It could have changed. And then we have All Star 2005. So, right, so these are pages about family structure, things like that. So once again, would you use these? If you use them, would you supplement? What kind of things do you notice here? So we have someone chimed in, antiquated assumptions for sure.
Was about the previous slide, I believe, but I mean,
also here.
Kind of applies here a little bit. So
a couple of the things that seem to be coming up are, we have 2 examples of teaching students family vocabulary. The 2 things that most stand out to me are that these 2 families appear very heteronormative. We have what appears to be men and women coming together, making children, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have a lot of variety in families. We have the kind of traditional American family. We don't have, or at least it doesn't appear that we have queer representation. We don't have single mom or single father. We don't have any of these things. And then weirdly, we don't have, one of the words we really need to teach our students is partner, because then they don't have to out themselves as gay or straight when we're having class discussions. not only do these 2 pages not include the word partner, they actually don't include any gender neutral terms. We don't have sibling, we don't have parent. So I don't know, some odd choices here. Let's see here. We have another comment, both reject any racial diversity and make bold assumptions about sex and gender. Absolutely, absolutely.
You guys word things well. Just, yeah.
Yeah, you guys are doing way better than us.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got these from the MIDTESOL journal. So these are kind of suggested discussion questions to use in your classroom. Of course, I picked out 4 particularly problematic ones, but right, so are there any thoughts about these ones? Okay, so the first one, at what age do you want to get married? There's an assumption here that students do want to get married. Number 2, do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? This is the kind of question we're talking about when we're talking about questions that cause you to out yourself. So do you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? To answer this in a class discussion, unless you just answer yes or no, and that's not really practicing English very well, right? To answer this question, you have to discuss if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend. So if you're in a homosexual relationship, in order to be honest, you have to out yourself. And in the other scenario, you have to lie. So this is exactly the kind of question that causes big trouble. You know, I can remember being in ESL classes where, or not ESL, Spanish classes and things, where these kind of questions really threw me off.
This was a thing in Russian classes too, where you get
right.
this, and you're in Russia answering these questions, and that's not necessarily
right,
where I was feeling the safest. So
you teach a student a word like partner. Do you have a partner? Now they don't have to go into a lot of detail about sexuality. What do you think about same-sex marriage? Making same-sex marriage a controversy, so let's not. And the last time, what kind of boy or girl do you like? This assumes that you like boys or girls, that you're not asexual. It assumes that you're not interested in genderqueer people. Lots of assumptions here. So, right, let's see. A comment for the first one, what age do you want to get married? So my comment was that this assumes that you want to get married, and we have a comment here that says, or can get married. So that's also
great point.
an excellent point.
I think the problem with a lot of these questions, and these ones especially, and you know, any of these things that we've been talking about, again, they're questions that we're just so used to answering that when we see them, we just think, whatever, it's fine. So again, keeping in mind that what we really mean is like, look at these questions a little bit more. What kinds of answers are we looking for as well? And what kinds of answers do we think we might get?
That's right.
Yeah.
So I have, this is an article that I sometimes use in class. It is about Alison Bechdel, who created the Bechdel test, and she, a while back, won the MacArthur Prize. So, so this is an article about her winning the prize, what she's going to do with the money. She talks about saving for retirement and some things like this. So she's a queer person. She's the originator of the Bechdel test, which is, which appeared in her comic, Dykes to Watch Out For. So the Bechdel test is a test of movies and other, literature and media. So the test is, for a movie to be like a movie that this character would want to watch, it has to have 2 women in it who have names, who talk to each other about anything other than a man. So, it was meant as a joke, but people apply it quite widely now. So even though she's a queer writer who writes about queer issues, this particular cartoon, or rather this particular article, is not dogmatizing our students with the idea that queerness is okay. It's just discussing that she's a writer who won this prize. So this is a good example of acknowledging a queer person's existence without making their identity queerness. You know, she's a woman who is saving for retirement, you know, so.
It would be very easy, right? Again, what you're saying with her writing, right? She's a known writer about queer issues and queer rights and things like that. So it would be very easy to make this about that, but in reality, it doesn't, which is kind of refreshing.
Right.
So this is my bread and butter, I guess, books and longer narratives. So I like to use fictional podcasts as well. And those have this very episodic kind of idea. And it creates this longer narrative that you can do over weeks at a time. But there are some issues. So for example, a book that I just read, Luna, New Moon, it's questionable. I use the word questionable. I don't know if I like that word. I liked this book. I thought it represented people quite well, but it does use, so it's about the moon, and if you're and about these companies that run the moon and mine the moon, and they're all families and things like that, and it's talking about their interrelationships. The author uses non-binary characters to kind of show how open and futuristic the society is, and they also show that, oh, people from Earth are very shocked by the way people live up here. So it's kind of proving this point about society. But all of the main characters that we have, every character that we care about, every character that pushes the plot forward, every character that has any kind of agency to make the choices that they want to, are cisgender, use pronouns that match their sex, as opposed to a lot of other characters that don't. So this is an example, kind of what I was talking about before, where the characters are used for their sexuality or for their identity, not necessarily for the plot anyway.
That's right.
Something I found less questionable, and I always get excited when I see representation where I didn't expect it. In Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer, it's the third book in the Annihilation series. If you have read those, there's a movie, whatever. But the main character's story, or a main character's story, is told in a flashback to kind of give us the beginning of some of these strange happenings and explain how they came about, and explain how another character became involved in this story. His sexuality is revealed relatively early in the book, but it's a non-starter, right? It's just like, oh, there's this person I've been dating, whatever. But again, those are just the asides, right? To show that this person is a human being who has a life outside of this weird plot that's going on. But most of the things happening are to him deal with this as well. So that's kind of a difference that I would want to stress for longer books and narratives.
Are there any thoughts before we move on? Can also move on and come back if anyone has any thoughts. This is a,
and again, if this is a little not visible, as if the other one was as well, sorry, but we can kind of explain it.
Yeah, so take a moment, look through this. This is part of a essay by David Sedaris called Today's Special. So at this point, if you can't see, I'll just summarize. So this is the start of an essay. It's about David and his partner Hugh at a restaurant in New York, eating like a fancy restaurant. And David Sedaris is kind of criticizing New York restaurants as being pretentious and things like this. I love the line, it's hard to love a place that's outlawed smoking, but finds it perfectly acceptable to serve raw fish in a bath of chocolate. Nice line. So the point of this essay is about kind of pretense and dining in these New York restaurants and stuff like this. But he's also at the restaurant with his partner. So once again, the fact that he has a partner is not the meat and potatoes of this story. It just is something that's true while he's talking about other things that we can all relate to. So we're not tokenizing his queerness. It exists in the context of a story that is wonderful in its own right. So.
Right. I would say this is an interesting example of, so I like those books and longer narratives, but if that's not something that you're looking for, you can also find it in these more short stories. So you can kind of make things inclusive a little bit without having to kind of do something for 4 weeks or 5 weeks, right? It can be something that you do relatively quickly.
Yeah, and I use a lot more, articles and short stories in my classes, so I end up with a lot of these. Right. We're gonna talk about the conclusions here, and then if there are any other questions, feel free to type them out, and then I'll read them and we can discuss them before we end. So once again, we want to stress, no source is going to be perfect in every way, but you need to consider your sources, the assumptions those sources are making, what we're using them for, and this does include textbooks, because sometimes the textbooks are a little bit behind the level that we'd like them to be at. And even though this discussion has been about LGBTQIA issues, this applies across the board. So your program, your department, your IEP maybe has a list of books that you guys use every semester. Go through the list of books. If most of the authors are white people, that's something to consider. If there are no queer authors, that's something to consider. Ableism, social status, health, like these are all things that we want to consider. And we don't need to have every book, like we were saying earlier. It's not that you can't teach a book by a white, straight, cisgender, male person. That's fine. But that shouldn't be the majority of your books. Any other thoughts there?
No, I like that. It was
worded
right. Well. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to see if we have any other questions, and if we don't, I'm going to thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
Let me just check in.
We do have some, I think, so you have access to this already?
Yeah, go.
Yeah, so there are things past the conclusion, and again, but they're just kind of examples of inclusive things that we have if you wanted to look through these.
Right.
If you have more, obviously, please email us and tell us everything. But some of these for inclusive books, David Sedaris, we go back to, and then all of these little bullet points, we give you some kind of what it's about, as opposed to not who's in it. We're kind of promising, at least, that
right.
we think they're inclusive in a way that is effective. So these are inclusive books, but we also have podcasts, because I love podcasts. Most of these are narrative. The first 5, I believe, are. The last one is more a storytelling podcast where people every episode tell you different stories about certain things. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I should also mention before we go to the references that these books are not leveled. So some of them are appropriate for higher education, some are appropriate for lower level IEPs, things like that. So we have a question about this one. The question says, did you specifically look for the Sedaris story, or was it in an anthology? And the answer is, it's in a book called, which is in the references.
So Me Talk Pretty One Day.
Yeah, so it's this one here called Me Talk Pretty One Day. So it's in that one. There are a lot of his essays that turn up in textbooks and things like this. He has an essay called The Learning Curve that I actually believe is in the same book, but The Learning Curve was in one of the ESL textbooks I was teaching out of a while ago. Mm-hmm. So he pops up every now and again. He has a couple, I think in this book specifically, he has a few essays that people have been using in a variety of contexts. This is an interesting book. I'm actually teaching it this semester. So in this book, he is, for a majority of this book, he's in France learning French, and he has a very mean French teacher. So the students kind of empathize because they're in class, English class in America with their very mean English teacher.
Mhm.
So there's comparisons and things that they can make there. So I recommend that book. It's a nice one.
He writes very relatedly. It's easy to kind of just get into his world.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. So we'd like to thank you all for joining us, and we hope that we can put together more webinars in the future. If you have any ideas or if you have any interest, hopefully you're a member of one of the MIDTESOL interest sections, and you can talk to your chair and maybe give them some ideas, and they can communicate them, and hopefully we can put together a few more of these. So thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you so much.